Thank you. Welcome everybody to our first opening dialogue for day one, which is a day about the past of Canadian comics. And I'm fortunate to welcome John Bell as the other side of the dialogue. And there's much more to John Bell than just the two monographs that most comic book researchers are familiar with. John Bell is a former senior archivist at Library and Archives Canada, and the author or the editor of more than 20 books touching on various aspects of Canadian history and culture. His work has also appeared in numerous periodicals, anthologies, and collections. John has often focused on neglected aspects of Canadian popular culture, particularly science fiction and fantasy, on the pulps, and of course on comics. He, in his 1986 groundbreaking book, Canuck Comics, was issued by Matrix Books. In 1992, he served as a curator of the Canadian Museum of Caricature exhibition, Guardians of the North, the national superhero in Canadian comic art, which later resulted in a Canada Post stamp issue to which John contributed. In 1996, John donated his 4,000 plus Canadian comic book collection to the Rare Books Division of the National Library. Not long after, he worked with the library to transform the Guardians of the North exhibit and book into a website and web exhibition. In 2002, he and the Quebec comic scholar, Michel Viau, co-curated the website Beyond the Funnies, the history of comics in English Canada and Quebec. In 2006, John's History of the Canadian Comic Books, Invaders from the North, was published by Dundurn Press. John has also contributed essays and articles on Canadian comics to the Canadian Encyclopedia and such periodicals as the Comic Journal, Maisonneuve, and Alter Ego. During recent years, the focus of John's research has shifted to subjects that include military history and Canadian non-sports cards. His most recent book is Oak Island Illustrated, the 225-year search for the truth and treasure. Welcome, John, and it's a privilege for me to be engaged in a conversation with you, and I look forward to this very much.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and delighted that you invited me.
Oh, wonderful. Let me begin by saying that my own interest in comics began in the 60s with the big bang of the Marvel Universe. And I became acquainted with the fact that Canada had its own comics with the Patrick Loubert and Michael Hirsch book, Great Comic Book Heroes, which came out in 1971. That's how I got interested in this field. Can I ask you, how did your interest in all those marginal cultures, subcultures such as science fiction and comic books come about? And how did you become aware of Canadian comic books and become interested in them?
Well, like you, I was, as a boy, I was a Marvel addict. Mm-hmm. And I really almost felt like a junkie. I had to buy every Marvel comic book published. You know, there were even weeks where the only Marvel comic was Millie the Model. Okay, I'll buy it. Mm-hmm. I, like you, discovered the Hirsch and Loubert book in 71. I was working in an independent bookstore in Halifax at that time. And I was stunned to discover that there had been Canadian comic books, that there was a generation of Canadian kids who grew up with Canadian heroes, Canadian graphic narratives. That was just an absolute revelation. You know, for those of us who grew up on the US superhero comics, and they were thrilling, they were powerful, especially the Jack Kirby narratives. It was for us, though, as Canadians, a particularly alienating experience, because you always knew in the back of your mind that, you know, me living in Halifax and Montreal, that Fantastic Four weren't coming to Halifax. That wasn't going to happen. It underscored the notion that we were kind of living in a bit of a hinterland, a place bereft of heroes. My own interest in Canadian comics was kind of sparked by that Hirsch and Loubert book, but when I really started to explore it was a little later, after I graduated from Dal, and I joined the staff of the Dalhousie University Archives. And at that time, I started getting interested in some of the marginal aspects of our culture, Canadian science fiction and fantasy, Canadian comics. And I can kind of trace that back to the discovery of the Buyer's Guide to Comic Book Fandom. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Most of the people watching this today wouldn't know what I was talking about. But it was a weekly tabloid devoted to comics, published in the US, usually 3 sections, well over 100 pages every issue. It had some editorial content like interviews and some reviews and profiles of creators, but it was mostly classified ads for comics, fanzines, small press publications. And through the pages of that magazine, I connected with Gene Day and Dave Sim and a lot of the people active in the science fiction and fantasy and comics semi-prosing in Canada. And as I became more and more familiar with that and more involved as a contributor and reader, I came to realize that there was activity in Canadian comics. There were people in the mid-70s creating Canadian comics. And about that same time, I discovered Orb and Captain Canuck on local newsstand. And so that, I think, is sort of where my interest began. And I was fortunate, so at a certain point, though, it became obvious to me that the Canadian SF and comics tradition had really been seriously neglected. And there was very, very little work out there touching on either of those traditions. So I started to think, I was working in archives within a library setting. I started to think that, maybe I should start work on a bibliography of Canadian science fiction and fantasy, and maybe also a checklist of Canadian comics and just see what's out there and start digging. So that's how it all started. Not long after that, I had the good fortune to meet Owen McCarran, who ran the Giveaway Studio, Comic Book World. And he was an extremely generous, open person. And he was working for Marvel at that time. And he invited me out to his studio. I went out and I left there with copies of virtually every single giveaway that he had produced. And he'd taken the time to date them all as well. So as a bibliographer of Canadian comics, this was pretty exciting. Walking off with 30 or 40 new entries of touching on these, obscure comics that most people weren't even familiar with. And then maybe a year after that, I stumbled on a small archive of Bell Features material in a science fiction bookstore in Halifax. I have no idea what the provenance of this material was, how it ended up in Halifax, I don't know. But what it consisted of was hundreds of Bell Features production regs, textual records, a small body of textual records, including contracts and correspondence, and a lot of file copies of Bell Features comics. So that, really helped me, helped me along in terms of building my golden age collection. But the obvious thing for me as I was working on the comic book checklist is I realized there were no institutional holdings to speak of. That if I was going to document Canadian comics, I had to accumulate my own research collection, which is what I started doing in the mid-70s.
Now, American fandom has put on sort of a stratification on their comic book history. Things such as the Golden Age, the Silver Age, Bronze Age, and so on. Is that a template that we can transpose to Canadian comics, do you think, or must be a different way of looking at them?
I think there is a different way, and I'm uncomfortable with those American demarcations, all the various ages. I mean, what are we in now? The lithium age? I do think, though, that there are distinct periods in our history And I've pointed to those in and outlined them in my book, Invaders from the North. But I think I should really underscore, though, that that's just one person's opinion. And I would expect that other people will look at the history of Canadian comics and define those periods differently and, assign in terms of relative importance, maybe weigh it all in a different fashion. And I would welcome that. In fact, I expect that to happen. I would encourage people to challenge my narrative, my take on it all.
Good, that's healthy. I think I agree with you. I think we just can't transpose the American template right on Canadian comics. It's such a varied history. But given that history, you and I have watched Canadian comics develop from a very marginal existence up to a graphic narrative now, Canadian graphic narrative that fills our bookshelves in stores like Chapters Indigo and fills our libraries. It's become very popular, and even scholarship and comics in general has grown to acceptability. Are we at the point where we can say there is a definite Canadian comics legacy or tradition, even given the global world we live in now with all the internet connections we have? Can we still think about Canadian comics as having a legacy and a tradition?
Well, we certainly have our own tradition. We have our own distinct history, particularly if you factor in Quebec Bay Day.
Yeah.
That makes us quite unique. I think that the bicultural aspect of our comic tradition. We have our own stories. We have our own heroes and anti-heroes. But whether we're distinct in terms of formal or stylistic considerations, that's another matter altogether. Is there a uniquely Canadian way of doing comics, of making comics? Perhaps not. What are your thoughts in that regard?
Going back to its origins in those strange wartime comics, we definitely did have a Canadian take on comics. It was so patriotic because we were involved in the war. But they quickly became marginalized after the war was over and disappeared into history. And then it was hard for us to chip out and eke out some sort of Canadian comic book identity, which happened in the 70s, as you say. I think there is a legacy, and that's what my original idea for a gathering like this would be, to celebrate that legacy, and not just a pure celebration, but recognize the voices that have been left out and need to be heard in that legacy. So I would say there is one. Now, connected to that, part of the pursuit of Canadian comics has been to produce a sort of national or nationalistic hero.
Yeah. Dating
back to Nelvana, going through Canuck, all those iterations. What's your idea on that? I don't know how to put the question, but what is the role of a nationalistic hero in our tradition of comics?
Well, I think it's inevitable. After when comic book artists and writers in Canada discovered the Hirsch and Lubert book and the wartime comics and our wartime superheroes, you could see reflected in the small press comics of that same era and in the fanzines that a real kind of nationalist current emerged in Canadian comics. And I think that was a natural reaction to that discovery and to the domination of American comics in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how successful anyone has been in creating a Canadian national superhero. But I think it's something, as long, superhero comics will remain an extremely important current within the field of comics. And so I think it's natural that Canadian creators, fans of superhero comics, will endeavor, make that attempt. And there've been many of them over the years to create a distinctly Canadian superhero. I think it's something we'll just see happen cyclically over and over again. That seems inevitable. In terms of legacy, I mean, and I know you've put an enormous effort into drawing attention to those comics and documenting the history of the wartime comics. Whether that becomes a legacy or not really depends on our creators, whether they are aware of that tradition and they decide to continue it and build on it in some way and reinterpret it. I hope that will continue, and I'm sure you do as well.
I do, very much so, yes.
So an event like this, I think, will really contribute to that. And I think that's a good thing, positive thing.
Now, aside from the superhero comics, we've got a magnificent tradition of graphic narrative. And I think of, say, Joe Ullman's recent selection to the final list of Governor General Awards nominations in literature, and his work, Fictional Father. It's a wonderful level to get to. What is your take on the growth of graphic narrative in the Canadian comics tradition?
Well, I think, you and I have talked about this before, comics have become extremely mainstream, and that is certainly a welcome development. I mean, to go into, when I was a kid and when you were growing up as well, comics were everywhere. They were widespread. They were in the grocery stores. They were in drugstores. They were in corner stores. They were in tobacco stores. You could find them practically everywhere but bookstores and libraries. Now you go into Indigo and there's huge sections devoted to graphic narrative and bound volumes of comics, and that's fantastic. I think it's something that we should certainly welcome. And I think that the more respectable comics become, I hope that we also don't lose sight of its comics' more pulpish roots, right? And less respectable forms of graphic narrative.
Yeah, there's an essential dialectic there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of the challenge for the library and archival community. That it's easy now to document the mainstream Canadian comics and graphic narratives and graphic novels, but there's still marginal stuff going on out there. And that's a real challenge to continue to document that. The little, the Xerox fanzines, local fanzines, and the really edgy and fringe stuff. That takes an enormous amount of imagination and effort, and effort, of course, translates into resources and money for institutions that set out to document Canadian comics.
Now, at one point, you began buying up every comic you could see and find that was Canadian.
Right.
What was the intent of that, and what happened to that?
Well, I looked around at the Overstreet, for example. If you look at kind of bibliographical work in comics, and I decided that if I was going to document Canadian comics, I wouldn't, like Overstreet, document just the newsstand comics. That it was important to try and document all forms, including the underground comics, giveaway comics, the small press comics in particular. They were in many respects the biggest challenge. In fact, by the mid-90s, when the Xerox photocopy technology had evolved to such a degree that it was hard to distinguish between that and offset printing, then all of a sudden, anyone engaged in the production and in comics practice could publish it relatively inexpensively. So that meant that all these incredibly energetic and creative comic milieus were emerging all over Canada. Every large community had a zine scene, and people were churning out comics, and it was a really, really exciting period. But for someone like me trying to document all this stuff, it became apparent to me that that would be impossible for one person to do it, that it would have to become a collective endeavor. And by 95 or thereabouts, I'd been at it for almost 20 years. And I was suffering from a kind of a collector's fatigue. And so I decided, that for me was enough in terms of collecting and documenting, that I couldn't do it anymore in any kind of exhaustive way. So then I started to look around for a home for the comics I had accumulated, my research collection. And at that point, I fortunately met up with Michel Brisebois, who was very open, who was had rare books at the National Library at that time. And Michel was extremely open to popular culture and ephemeral print culture. So he was keen to get my comic collection. So I was very happy that it found a home and that it would be available for other researchers in the future.
And that's so important. This idea that we need a national repository of Canadian comics. Right now, there's certain deposits at the Library and Archives of Canada. I know that Western University has a bunch of old Canadian comics, and also in Toronto we have at Ryerson. There's a bunch there, and then libraries have scattered deposits all over the country. How important is a sort of a main repository, at least a network of all these repositories that can be accessed by researchers and people who are just interested in Canadian comics?
I think it's crucial for anyone doing research, anyone who's trying to take a historical perspective on the development of Canadian comics. It's it's absolutely necessary that we see more institutions making an effort to document the comics, but working cooperatively to share. We don't, whether we have a single national institution that takes on that challenge, maybe that's not so important. I mean, I'm really glad to see the National Library is making an effort, and Library and Archives Canada, now Library and Archives Canada. But I'm glad to see that collections are also emerging in other institutions, university archives, university libraries. And I think the key for researchers would be that these institutions find some way to collectively describe and share information about their holdings.
And not only repositories or archives, but we've had a rise of Canadian comics in galleries, in libraries, in museums even. And that's an important connection all around. In the last century, Canadian comics seemed marginalized. We talked about this on the fringes, but as the century grew, we've had graphic narrative rise up. And I don't think we should, looking back on this tradition, I don't think we should simply wave our maple leaf flags in the celebration of 80 years of Canadian comics, starting with a floppy, without the sobering recognition of the voices that are marginalized and have been marginalized throughout the tradition, throughout those 8 decades, from that first Canadian floppy. Voices such as even the voices of women, of Aboriginals, of queer communities, of immigrants, and so on. One thing that I'm very proud and happy of is these voices are growing in our comics now. What is your take on this?
Well, I think it's important that we realize that comics are cultural artifacts. and they tend to reflect the societal values and attitudes of their time. But this would be true of just about every aspect of our popular culture, not just comics. But we should definitely welcome and encourage attempts to come to terms with any legacy of racism and marginalization. Personally, I'm keen to see new approaches to the history of Canadian graphic narrative. That, as I've said before, is one of the it was probably my main motivation for donating my collection, is that the hope that people would look at the comics in a different way and reinterpret our history from all kinds of different vantage points. So that's all to be welcome, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, you were involved in the archival sense of Canadian history and Canadian comic books, but you also drew out of this by putting on a bunch of exhibits and making a web presence of this information there. How important is it for our comic book legacy in Canada not to be shut behind closed doors in archives, but to be accessible through galleries and libraries and museums?
I think that's incredibly important. When you look back at the Hirsch and Lubert book, that was accompanied by a National Gallery exhibition that toured the country and had enormous impact, I think. And it received an incredible amount of media attention, and it allowed people to rediscover this neglected aspect of their history. Now, at the end of that exhibition and the tour of that material, the gallery, and it probably would kind of rank as one of their most successful exhibitions ever, they decided that maybe this stuff isn't for us, though, in terms of making it part of our holdings. And I think they encouraged Hirsch and Lubert to maybe talk to those people at the archives. And, perhaps it would be more appropriate for the material to go there. But I know that, Guardians of the North exhibition that I did at the Museum of Caricature, that received an incredible amount of attention in the national media and even some international coverage. In fact, the first person to cover it in the media was a guy working for the International Herald Tribune and Washington Post. And he wrote a piece that appeared in the International Herald Tribune and in the Post, and then was picked up by other American newspapers. And, the gist of the story was, you're not going to believe this, that there are such a thing as Canadian superheroes. And all of a sudden, the Canadian media, noting that the American media was interested, they became very interested. And, we were kind of deluged with requests for interviews and that sort of thing. But what was great about that show is that people could come in the museum and we had the original artwork and we had drafts of scripts, and, they could learn about how comics were produced, what a piece of original comic art actually looked like, and what a comic book script looked like, and what the dialectic between the two. And that's really important there. But whether or not institutions are prepared to do that in this new era, I don't know. I think it's much more, I think they're more inclined to do a web exhibition. But I think it's important for people to see the original artwork.
Now, few people know that up at the Library and Archives, they have over 2,300 pages of original Bell Features artwork.
That's right.
That came along with the whole run of almost of the Bell Features comics. This came from Lubert and Hirsch, who managed to acquire it from John Ezrin back in 1971-72, and then sold it to, what was that? I think it was a National Gallery then, I'm not sure, or a library. Do you know anything about the story of selling this? Because from this money they got from the sale of this material, they were able to start their Nelvana animation studio, which went on to worldwide success. Can you fill in any of the background of this from your perspective, John?
I can't say a lot about it, but as I noted before, the gallery, I think, made a decision that they didn't want it. They were happy to exhibit it and have a touring exhibition based on that material, but they didn't see that it was something that really belonged in their collection. But at that time, the National Archives, maybe even Public Archives of Canada at that time, did have a major collection, or was starting to build a major collection devoted to political cartooning and caricature. So I think that they probably directed Hirsch and Lubert to the Public Archives and said, you should talk to these people. Fortunately, whoever was in charge of documentary art at that time realized how important that material was, and were willing to negotiate with them and arrange for its acquisition. I mean, that was a very, that took a lot of imagination, and I have to applaud whoever was responsible for that. It also included archival textual records as well. Quite a significant collection.
Yes. Can you, talking about a repository like that up at LAC, if there is an artist here or a collector or a historian who might have significant material, would you encourage them to donate it? And what should they think about if they're considering donating to an archive?
Well, one of the great developments during the course of my curatorial work on Guardians was that focusing on national superheroes, I decided that I would also not only deal with the Bell Features material and draw on those holdings that the archives already had, but I would continue on and look at Captain Canuck and Northern Light and the other Canadian national superheroes of the more contemporary period. But we didn't have those holdings. So that meant that I had to go out, connect with those creators, tell them about what we were doing, and convince them to loan their artwork. Also, I had to convince the people inside the archives that let's tell the full story, not just the Bell Features story. And let's be willing to take this material in and take it in on loan and display it. But it also represented an incredible opportunity for acquisition too, because that gave us an entry with all those artists. And we could talk to them about their legacy, about their archival records. And as a result of that, that exhibition became a vehicle for acquisition for the archives. And they acquired a lot of original artwork and textual material relating to various Canadian superheroes. So that was a good thing. And what is happening now at the archives in terms of acquisition policy at LAC? I mean, Megan perhaps can shed more light on that at some point. But I would certainly encourage anyone who's sitting on our archival records, artwork, and textual records to connect with the archives and have a chat with them.
Now, it's my understanding it's still a legal requirement, John, that every publication in Canada send 1 or 2 copies, depending on the number of their runs, to the archives. Can you comment on this a little bit?
Well, I think that's, and again, Megan probably can shed more light on that, but it does mean that kind of inadvertently, the library has amassed an impressive collection of Canadian comics. They're scattered throughout the collection, and they're coming in because of that that legal requirement. But when it comes to the small press publications and the real fringe stuff and the underground, how many of those creators are even aware of the requirement? You know, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of small zines and small press comics that are being produced, and the creators have no idea that they're obliged, and that the library would, they're obliged to make that donation, and the library is, you know, would welcome receiving that material. But, you know, it's a challenge, I think, getting that message out, that it is a requirement, and it's a positive thing for everyone.
Well, I'm so glad that you've become part of this this symposium on Canadian comics, this first iteration of what we hope will be something to carry on into the future. Can you, again, you've shared your thoughts a little bit about the importance of this. Can you say anything else about things that you'd like to see done in a gathering like this, or how significant it is?
Well, I certainly welcome events like this, and I certainly appreciate the invitation to attend. My one concern would be that I would hate to see symposiums like this and gatherings of this kind to be over-reliant on the academy.
Yes.
And dominated by the academy. I hope that there will always be room for independent researchers and creators and publishers and other non-academics, because I think they have a lot to contribute as well.
That was exactly the essence of our mandate when we thought of this, establishing this symposium. My last question, we're running to the end of time, and would like to entertain some questions from the audience. But my last question to you is, do you have any thoughts on, say, the future of Canadian comics in another 80 years, or even in a near future? What do you see happening in Canadian comics?
That's really difficult to anticipate. I mean, I think that comics are here to stay. Comics are mainstream. I think there will always be a marginal current within our comics, and I hope that there are people out there that will make an effort to document that. I think that who can anticipate where technology is going? I mean, that's obviously going to have an enormous impact on comics and graphic narrative. There's one thing I could point to, though, in terms of scholarship. I hope that someday someone's going to take up the challenge to produce a full bibliography of English Canadian comics, you know, and continue the work that I did with Canuck Comics, and then you did with your guide to wartime comics. You know, to me, that a bibliography like that, and in Quebec, they're fortunate. People like Michel Viau and Rosaire Fontaine have done, you know, remarkable work in documenting their comics. And we need someone to do that in English Canada, because, you know, I think that a bibliography, and it doesn't have to be a price guide. In fact, I hope it isn't a price guide, but a bibliography like that is kind of a foundation for further scholarship. Let's document the full scope of the production of comics in Canada. I hope that we see someone tackle that challenge.
I'd really look forward to that happening as well. And for all you younger people out there, there's a task for you to take on. Well, I think we've come to the end point of our conversation and our dialogue. I'd like to turn this over to audience questions for the remainder of our hour. And let's see what we have. I see one here from Lucia. John, based on your experience both as an archivist and private collector, do you have any initial suggestions, first steps, what institutions like archives with special collection departments and even public libraries would need to do to develop a sustainable infrastructure to preserve past Canadian comics, but also to document the current market?
Well, as I mentioned before, in order to do that, you need an extraordinary commitment. You need staff, you need time, you need resources, you need a financial commitment that has to be sustained. Often you'll see a great enthusiasm for the development of a collection within a library or special collections context. But that may be driven by one person or one donation. And over time, that enthusiasm peters out and resources get redirected. And, the effort isn't sustained. And certainly when it comes to the really marginal comics and the small press stuff, comics that maybe aren't really distributed beyond a particular, town or city, that takes an enormous effort to find and to acquire. And I don't know how many institutions today are prepared to do that.
Yes. Well, I have another question from Jolene Grove. She'd like you to comment, John, if you could, on what she sees as a negative when it comes to Canadian comics, that there's been that institutional support for graphic history in Canada has been systematically blocked for perhaps almost the last century, that things haven't been saved, that it hasn't been documented probably in universities. And she says that it's imperative that some sort of network cataloging and access be established so that this huge area of Canadian culture is properly accounted for as a legitimate aspect of culture writ large. That's her position. What can you comment on that?
Well, I do think that the effort has to be collective. But when you're asking institutions to cooperate, again, it's tied in with budgets and managerial decisions, and whether that cooperation could be sustained over any significant length of time, I don't know. It really is a challenge. I mean, when I look at the galleries, libraries, archives, and museum community, and I welcome the fact that they now have turned their attention to some degree to comics and graphic narrative. But when you look at one of the other things I'm interested in is Canadian non-sports cards, the cards issued with tobacco and cereal and gum. And, this is a significant part of our print culture. And I have made, just as I threw myself into comics, I threw myself into documenting these things. And, I've done a book on them, and I've documented 1,200 different sets of Canadian premiums and trading cards that were issued since they were first issued as inserts in tobacco in the 1870s. And but if you look at the holdings, and to my mind, this is an important part of our print culture, an important part of our graphic history. There are no institutional holdings of these cards to speak of. No one's making an effort in that regard. So it's difficult to convince institutions to turn their attention to marginal material like this, and then cooperate with other institutions, and then sustain that cooperation. Those are all pretty big challenges.
And that, to me, is something that characterizes Canadian comic legacy as well, that it's something that seems to be constantly eroding and being lost because it's not recognized as important and being seen as marginal or disposable. And we're losing so much material that maybe will never be recovered. And not only is there a drain that way, but there's a question from Irene here that states that many Canadian creators produce for American publishers, and not only a loss of material, but we have a loss of talent that may be going down south below the border. There's a Canadian drain of talent in the Canadian publishing community. Is there a drain of Canadian talent or suppression of Canadian regional identities because of this? how do we qualify Canadian work published by American publishers? There's a whole slew of stuff that's published below the border that has direct connection to Canada. Where does that fit in?
That's a real challenge. I mean, for me as a collector, I acquired some of that material, but that was not the focus of my collection. But you know, we need again a bibliographical effort in that regard, right? Trying to document the Canadian contribution to American graphic narrative, and it's extremely significant.
Yes, I can think of the Billy Ireland, for instance, recently getting Ho Chi Minh's complete work on his King graphic narrative about Martin Luther King. Perhaps that does appropriately belong in an American archive, but there's so much other stuff that needs to be. When I've gone to some studios of artists, I've seen stuff just stuffed in boxes in the corner and not being preserved and perhaps being damaged by this stuff. This needs to be saved. It needs to be a movement towards preserving this stuff and then making it accessible to future generations.
Absolutely.
Just looking at some other questions here. Here's another question from Irene. Oh, that's the same question, excuse me. John, you worked, you've worked mostly on Anglo-Canadian comics, and Michel Viau worked and is working on French Quebecois BD. To your knowledge, is there any researchers, archivists working on the intersection of both?
Not to my knowledge, but I think it's important.
Yes.
You know, when we talk about Canadian creators contributing to American comics, there's also Quebec creators contributing to French comics in Europe.
Yes. Another question from Jalene, or comment. She says that archivists themselves have been supportive of archiving material. The systematic part of the suppression seems to be rooted in overseers and gatekeepers at institutions and universities. They set the mandates and the agenda that people on the ground are limited by. Does that need to be modified or evolved more? That these gatekeepers at these institutions set what needs to be acquired and the trends and the fads of archival collections?
Well, hopefully there'll be, as comics, you know, like an event like this, and the fact that Canadian comics are now mainstream. I think it becomes harder for those gatekeepers who might be hostile to popular culture to block efforts to document and collect in that area. You know, I think that there will be increasing demand that we turn our attention to our own popular culture and find ways to explore it and document it.
I'd like to ask you a question of my own. Do you see yourself doing any future work in terms of popular comic culture or cards again, or is everything turning towards your historical interest?
We're doing some work with regard to Canadian trading, non-sports trading cards. And I'm not sure, every time I think I've left comics behind, I get a phone call from someone like you. So what will happen? I'm not working on a comics related project right now, but I certainly would be happy to collaborate with anyone who wanted to take up my earlier challenge to do a full bibliography of English Canadian comic books. Because after completing work on Canuck comics, I did continue documenting comics for maybe another, quite exhaustively, for another 6 or 7 or 8 years. So I've got notes and manuscripts that probably won't see the light of day unless somebody else decides to do the work.
And have you got an archive in mind for your estate?
I don't actually, no. If someone wants to approach me, they can.
That should be rectified immediately. Now, I see a lot of those old wartime comics and other material from decades ago being reprinted now. And my understanding is that LAC and Chorus, for instance, on the Bell material they own copyright of a half each. Does reprinting these old things, do you see it as a boon? Or is it something that is breaking or a challenging copyright laws?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the status is now regarding those comics, but I'm glad to see people compiling them and doing reprints. I think that's a good thing. I'm not encouraging anyone to break copyright laws, but
of course,
I wouldn't do that.
Aside, that's important to me, and I see a question from Zach, who's also not only in a PhD in comic studies, but in education as well at Brock University. And I served as a high school teacher myself for almost 25 years. How difficult is it, do you see, to teach Canadian comics at high school level and elementary level, and even at post-secondary level? Should they be taught? Should there be, actually there's not even a pure department of comic studies in any post-secondary institution across the country. And I think this is another thing, just like a central archive that's lacking. I hope we can move towards that in the near future. Can you comment on something like that?
Well, I think that would be, I think it's an inevitable document, a development rather, that we'll see that. And it's certainly something I would welcome. But, I think, again, when you look at this symposium and the kind of historical research that's being undertaken and the articles that are being published and the fact that Canadian literature is going to devote an issue to graphic narrative, all these things kind of suggest that, there will be room for the study, more room for the study of our popular culture in institutions. And that's a good thing. That's important.
It is. Here I have a question from Eddie Smith, who donated his large collection of wartime comic books and 40s Canadian comic books, as well as a large donation of comics in general to Western University and their archives. He asks the question, excuse me, how safe are collections donated to archives in the long run? Or could it in the future, say some sort of future management start divesting archives of collections? Do they have to peel some off? Do they have to dispose of some? But what considerations does somebody donating make about something like that? How safe are those collections?
That's a good question. And I'm not sure what the answer is, because I'm not sure that we can guarantee what management will do or not do 20 or 30 years in the future. It certainly merits consideration and attention. And certainly in approaching a library and archives, I wouldn't hesitate to talk to them about that issue and see what their response is.
I think we're almost at the time where we should consider wrapping up. John, I'd like to thank you for being part of this and being our first presenter on our first iteration of this sort of symposium. I think if you'd like to hang around, well, though we bring this session to a close at this point, very much appreciative of your presence here for this. But if you'd like to hang around, we might have some questions from chat for another 15 or 20 minutes, if you'd be willing to do that.
Sure, I'm willing to do that. I want to thank you for the invitation. I'm quite happy to be here, quite honored to be here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I hope everybody else will look forward to the sessions that will be happening throughout the day and attend as many of them as are of interest to them. Thank you very much. So Dominic, should we take some time and entertain some more questions to see if there are any?
Yeah, sure.
That's perfectly fine. If there were unanswered questions in the chat, or if someone else, I think I just saw Wayne Morgan raise his hand. Actually,
Wayne, if you can unmute yourself, Wayne, could you ask your question?
There we go.
Thank you.
Hi,
Wayne
John.
is a gallery
Hey,
owner,
Wayne, how are you?
You probably know him very well.
Long time no see.
Exactly. This is a tangential question about Harold Pierce's collection. Were you involved in getting it into public hands?
No, and where did it go?
Oh, golly. I don't know. My question was going to be, he had a lot of pop culture stuff, and
Yes,
he
he
must
did.
have had RCMP comic books. And that was going to be my question.
Yeah,
Well, oh dear.
I can find out.
I corresponded with him for years and never got to meet him. And then
He was a wonderful guy.
Yeah, I expect so. Yes, indeed. But anyway, that was my brief question. Thank you.
Well, he and I had a chat about you and your mutual enthusiasms.
Yes.
And I am, through my wife, I am in touch with Virginia, and I will ask her what she did with all that material.
I do have her email. I just thought you were probably the local guy to help her out.
Yeah, they didn't, I wasn't involved in any way, so I don't know.
I will comment. I will comment though that when I was running the Dunlop in the 70s, it was an incredible period for attention to popular culture. About the same time as I had the World War II I had that show that the National Gallery circulated.
Okay.
And in fact, I had got permission from the National Gallery to acquire some work from the Vancouver business to add to that show, which is because I had read a few weeks previous about a guy who worked for the National Film Board, and he had, I think he had donated his stuff to the City of Vancouver Archives. And I went out there and saw it. It was absolutely gorgeous drawing, John Stables and those guys. And I got permission to acquire some and put it up with the.
Oh, that's great.
With the Bell stuff.
I didn't know that that happened. That's fantastic.
Well, it might have been the first public attention to that stuff, and we now know that what was it? It was being. They were first.
Yes, that's right.
Anniversary stuff.
That's
anyway, right. It was a bit of fun, but this is also the same time I did a pinball exhibition in '74, and that I think that show was also traveling around '74, '75, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. That sounds about right.
And so you were a pioneer in terms of popular culture in Canada.
Yeah, definitely, Wayne.
Well, I see my gallery was in a public library, and while some of my colleagues were still arguing whether or not photography was an art, I had open permission to do all kinds of stuff that others, wouldn't touch.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty heady time for sure. Anyway.
Thanks for your question, Wayne.
Okay.
I've got a more specific question from Val John. She says that I see that Rockman Books published your book on trading cards. That's the
Yeah.
Canadian non-sports catalog, vintage cards and related premiums, issued in Canada 1875 to 1975. Her question is, how can one reach Rockman Books? It sounds like it's your own company or something.
It's my own imprint, but the book, you can order the book through Lulu.
Through what? Sorry, I didn't hear it.
Lulu.
Lulu. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a self-publishing platform. So the book's available through them.
And
Okay, thanks, John. That's great.
Good. I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, my email is in the book.
Okay, great.
And here's a question from Ken Stacy, creator on the West Coast, who's well-known and has been a longtime fixture of Canadian comics. He says that in 2012, his wife Joan and he created the only program in comics and graphic novels in the Canadian post-secondary education system. It ran very successfully for 9 years at Camosun College in Victoria until the Institute stipulated that they have an MA. All instructors have an MA at least to teach courses, and disqualified all the professional comic creators who had previously instructed. And its program recently had a demise because of that. And this almost sounds like a political intervention into the program by the university to have such a demand. Is there any comments you can make on that?
That's a pathetic bias. That's pathetic. Imagine Harold R. Foster wouldn't be able to teach a course on comics. That, you know, it's ridiculous.
Yes, I agree completely. Well, I think that's everything that we have, John. We've continued a little bit, and I think we can finish here if there are no more questions I can see. And I really think it was a successful session, and thank you for it again.
Thank you, Ivan. Good to be with you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Zach posted the link and password for the next session a little further up in the chat if you don't have access to it immediately through the program. So you can, and there it is again, just appearing now. So if you don't have immediate access to it, you can copy that now, because I am going to end this meeting in just a minute or two so that we have time to get the next meeting set up and give presenters a bit of advance time to prepare in case there are any issues to deal with. Thanks, everyone. That was a great
wonderful
session.
Start.
And see everyone in half an hour or so, give or take.
Okay.